Imani Williams stood at the entrance of Ridgewood High School, gripping the straps of her backpack a little tighter than usual. It wasn't her first time being the new girl. Her father's work meant relocating more than once, but there was something different about this move. Maybe it was the weight of expectations, or maybe it was the unshakable feeling that her presence wasn't entirely welcome. Either way, she was determined to walk into this school with her head held high, knowing she had every right to be here. The moment Imani stepped into Miss S. Patterson's English classroom, that feeling of unease crystallized into something sharper, suspicion masked as politeness. Miss S. Patterson, an older woman with a thin smile stretched too tight, gave Imani a once-over that lingered just a moment too long. It was the kind of look Imani had learned to recognize, the subtle scan that measured her skin color before her potential. "Welcome, Imani, Miss S," Patterson said, her tone teetering between forced cheer and quiet dismissal. "Why don't you take a seat? Somewhere near the back." Imani's stomach knotted, but she kept her face calm. She knew this routine. In every school, there was always at least one teacher who assumed a black girl with confidence must be trouble waiting to happen. Still, Imani slid into her seat and opened her notebook, determined to prove herself, not just to her classmates, but to Miss S. Patterson herself. The class was discussing Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, a book Imani knew well. When Miss S. Patterson opened the floor for discussion on themes of racism and justice, Imani raised her hand. Her insights were clear, thoughtful, and rooted in both the text and the world she knew outside of it. But instead of engaging, Miss S. Patterson cut her off mid-sentence. "That's an interesting perspective," Miss S. Patterson said, her smile brittle. "But let's not inject too much modern politics into classic literature, shall we?" A few students chuckled. Imani felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't lower her hand. "I wasn't talking about politics," she replied. "I was talking about the reality the book reflects, a reality some of us still live with." The room fell uncomfortably silent. Miss S. Patterson's expression stiffened. It was clear she wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a student like Imani. Over the next few days, the tension grew thicker. Whenever Imani offered to participate, Miss S. Patterson either ignored her or brushed her comments aside. She gave other students who looked nothing like Imani, the chance to speak freely, even when their answers were incomplete or shallow. During group work, Imani often found herself isolated, left to work alone while her classmates gravitated toward familiar faces. Miss S. Patterson did nothing to intervene, her silence a quiet endorsement of the exclusion. Yet, despite it all, Imani refused to shrink. Each day, she came prepared. Her hand still rose in every discussion, even when she knew it might not be acknowledged. Her voice, though often ignored, never wavered. The subtle slights were familiar. Teachers who assumed she wasn't capable, classmates who mistook her confidence for arrogance, the constant tightrope walk between being invisible and being labeled a problem. But Imani's parents had taught her that her voice mattered, even when no one wanted to hear it. The breaking point came when Miss S. Patterson assigned a group project on themes in American literature. Imani worked tirelessly on her portion, focusing on how literature had historically reflected and challenged racial injustice. On presentation day, Miss S. Patterson barely looked at her, cutting off her explanation before she could finish. "We're here to discuss literature," Miss S. Patterson said, her tone clipped, not to air personal grievances. The humiliation was sharp, but it didn't break Imani. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. As her classmates stared, some awkwardly looking away, Imani stood taller. "If literature doesn't reflect reality, then what's the point of it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. It was a question no one in the room, not even Miss S. Patterson, could answer. Imani knew this was just the beginning. She wasn't afraid to stand alone. What mattered was that she stood, because every time she spoke up, she carved out a little more space for the next girl who would sit in that same seat, facing the same silence. In the days after Imani Williams first raised her hand in Miss S. Patterson's English class, the atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably. There were no outright insults, no shouted slurs, nothing that could be easily documented or reported. Instead, there was something colder, quieter, a silent wall building around Imani, brick by brick. Miss S. Patterson didn't need to openly criticize Imani. Her indifference spoke volumes. Every time Imani's hand went up, Miss S. Patterson's gaze slid right past her, landing on another student instead, a white student, who might only half answer the question, but still receive a smile and praise. Imani saw what was happening. She wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time she had been quietly pushed to the margins. But what stung the most wasn't Miss S. Patterson's dismissiveness. It was the silence of her classmates. The students at Ridgewood High weren't hostile, at least not directly. Most of them were polite in the way people are polite when they don't want to get involved. They didn't mock Imani, but they didn't invite her into conversations either. When group projects were assigned, there was always an awkward pause, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who's going to end up with Imani? It was easier to exclude her quietly, no cruelty, just absence. Miss S. Patterson did nothing to stop it. In fact, her silence gave permission for the rest of the class to follow her lead. When group work began, Miss S. Patterson would glance at Imani, see her sitting alone, and move on without a word. Imani, however, wasn't the type to shrink away. She completed entire projects on her own when no one wanted to partner with her. When class discussions drifted into shallow interpretations of the texts they were studying, she took notes anyway, not to impress anyone, but because she refused to let anyone dictate how much she would learn. But being strong didn't mean it didn't hurt. There were days she walked home from school, her backpack feeling heavier than it should, her silence thick with unsaid words. She replayed moments in class, the times she could have said more, fought harder, or stood up for herself more forcefully. At night, she would lie awake wondering if maybe her classmates didn't hate her. Maybe they were just afraid. Afraid to sit beside her, afraid to challenge Miss S. Patterson, afraid to say the wrong thing and draw attention to themselves. They weren't cruel, they were complicit, and sometimes that was worse. The only thing that kept Imani steady was the voice inside her, the one that reminded her of every conversation she'd had with her parents about dignity, courage, and refusing to let the world silence her. You don't have to make people like you, her father had told her once, but you do have to make sure they know you deserve to be there. That voice echoed every time she was passed over in class. Every time Miss S. Patterson praised another student for an idea Imani had raised just minutes earlier. Every time her classmates paired off, leaving her at the edge of the room. Imani knew the easiest thing to do would be to give up, to shrink herself into the quiet background, to make herself smaller so no one would feel uncomfortable. But she wasn't going to do that. If no one wanted to sit beside her, fine. She would spread her papers across the entire desk and take up all the space herself. If no one wanted to hear her answers, she would write them down and make sure her name was on every page. If Miss S. Patterson wanted to pretend she wasn't there, then Imani would make herself impossible to ignore. She didn't need the approval of her classmates, and she certainly didn't need the validation of a teacher who couldn't see past her skin. What Imani needed, and what she already had, was the unshakable knowledge that she belonged there, even if no one else believed it. For weeks, Imani Williams carried the weight of Miss S. Patterson's dismissiveness and her classmates' quiet indifference on her back, but she refused to let either crush her. Every morning, She walked into Ridgewood High School with her head held high, her notebooks carefully organized, and her mind filled with insights she was eager to share, even if no one seemed interested in hearing them. But the day Miss S. Patterson announced the group presentation assignment would be the day everything changed. Each group was tasked with exploring a central theme in American literature, drawing connections between classic novels and their relevance in the modern world. Imani's group, if you could call it that, consisted entirely of herself. No one volunteered to work with her, and Miss S. Patterson made no effort to assign her to a team. That was fine. Imani didn't need a group. She spent hours at home, meticulously researching the works of Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Harper Lee. She outlined the painful threads of racial injustice woven through these works, connecting their stories to the struggles faced by communities like hers, both past and present. This wasn't just a presentation for her, it was personal. Literature, after all, wasn't just words on a page, it was a mirror held up to society, and Imani wanted her class to see exactly what that mirror reflected. On the day of the presentations, the classroom was unusually quiet. Miss S. Patterson, perched at the front of the room with her grading clipboard, called each group forward, lavishing praise on even the most superficial projects. When it was Imani's turn, she rose with her materials in hand, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. She began with the historical backdrop, explaining how early American literature often erased or vilified people who looked like her. Moving through the Harlem Renaissance, she described how Black authors reclaimed their stories, exposing injustice, celebrating resilience, and demanding to be seen. But before she could finish her point, Miss S. Patterson cut in. "Let's not veer off into personal agendas," Miss S. Patterson said, her smile thin and patronizing. "This is a literature class, not a political forum." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Imani's fingers tightened around the edges of her notes, but she didn't sit down. "With all due respect," Imani said, her voice clear, "the personal is political, and literature has always reflected the struggles of the time in which it was written. To ignore that is to ignore the full meaning of these works." Miss S. Patterson's smile disappeared. "I think you're missing the point," she said curtly. "This is about analyzing the text, not inserting your personal experiences into the discussion." Imani's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to retreat. "I'm not inserting anything. These authors wrote about racial injustice because they lived it. The fact that I understand their words so clearly isn't a distraction, it's proof that their words still matter." The room was dead silent. Even the classmates who usually avoided eye contact were watching now, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Miss S. Patterson's face darkened, but before she could speak, Imani pressed on. "Literature doesn't exist in a vacuum. It reflects who we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And pretending those things aren't part of the story, that's the real distraction." The confrontation had left the class breathless. No one had ever stood up to Miss S. Patterson like that, certainly not a student like Imani, who had been so carefully ignored for weeks. For a long moment, Miss S. Patterson said nothing. Her silence wasn't a retreat. It was the silence of someone who realized their authority was no longer absolute. Imani returned to her seat, her hands trembling slightly, but her head high. No matter what Miss S. Patterson said or did next, she had refused to let her voice be erased. After class, some of her classmates approached her quietly. One girl offered a soft, "That was brave." A boy who had once avoided sitting near her whispered, "I didn't know any of that." Imani didn't need applause or validation, but knowing at least a few students had heard her, really heard her, made the weight she'd been carrying feel just a little lighter. That day, the silence in Miss S. Patterson's classroom was broken, and even if Miss S. Patterson didn't change, the students had seen something they couldn't unsee. Imani had reminded them, and herself, that sometimes the only way to change the story is to speak up, even if your voice is the only one daring to do so. Imani Williams had faced weeks of subtle exclusion, cutting remarks, and thinly veiled bias from her English teacher, Miss S. Patterson. But even after she stood her ground during her presentation, refusing to allow her voice to be silenced, the real confrontation was still ahead, and it would not take place in the classroom. The day after the presentation, Miss S. Patterson summoned Imani's parents to a meeting. It was a move Imani had anticipated. Teachers like Miss S. Patterson didn't tolerate students who challenged their authority, especially not students like her. Imani knew this meeting wasn't about discussing her performance. It was about sending a message. When Principal Carter walked into the meeting room, however, it wasn't just as the principal of Ridgewood High. It was as Imani's father. Miss S. Patterson's carefully rehearsed confidence faltered the moment she recognized him. It hadn't crossed her mind that the student she had been subtly targeting was the daughter of the very man who led the school. But Miss S. Patterson, ever composed, quickly masked her surprise. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone all professionalism. "I wanted to address some concerns about Imani's classroom behavior and the way her attitude has been disrupting the learning environment." Principal Carter sat down calmly, folding his hands on the table, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that Miss S. Patterson missed. "Please," he said, "I'm eager to hear exactly what concerns you have about my daughter." Mrs. Patterson proceeded to paint a distorted picture of Imani, a student who was overly sensitive, too focused on racial issues, and frequently bringing up personal politics that detract from the class's focus on literature. She described Imani's contributions as confrontational and implied that her presence was disruptive to the cohesion of the classroom. Principal Carter listened quietly, his expression never wavering. When Miss S. Patterson finished, he let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "Miss S. Patterson," he said evenly, "do you think it's inappropriate for students to discuss the role of race in American literature?" Miss S. Patterson hesitated. "It's important to stay academically focused," she said carefully. "We want students to engage with the text, not impose their personal experiences onto it." "Interesting," Principal Carter said, "because when I reviewed the curriculum, I noticed several assigned books: To Kill a Mockingbird, The Color Purple, and Their Eyes Were Watching God. These works explicitly confront race, identity, and systemic injustice. Are you suggesting that Imani's experiences as a black student are irrelevant to the very literature you're teaching?" Miss S. Patterson's lips tightened. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, "but it's important to foster a balanced environment." "Balanced for whom?" Principal Carter asked, his tone still calm, but now cutting through the room's false politeness like a blade. "Balanced for students who have never had to question whether they belong in a classroom. Balanced for students who have never been singled out, silenced, or made to feel like their very presence is disruptive." Miss S. Patterson's silence was telling. "Let me be clear," Principal Carter continued. "Imani isn't disruptive. She's engaged, she's insightful, and she's brave enough to speak up when the literature demands it, even when she knows her voice will be dismissed. That isn't a problem. That's what education is supposed to foster: critical thinking, personal connection, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions." Miss S. Patterson shifted in her seat. "One didn't mean to imply that her voice doesn't matter," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "But you did," Principal Carter replied, "every time you dismissed her comments. Every time you gave the floor to students with less to say, but more privileged to say it. Every time you allowed your bias, whether conscious or not, to shape how you treated her." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room. Miss S. Patterson, so used to controlling the narrative, found herself with no ground to stand on. "This isn't just about Imani," Principal Carter added. It's about the environment you're creating for every student in your class, and whether or not you're willing to make that classroom a place where all voices are valued, not just the ones you're comfortable hearing. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation, just an undeniable truth laid bare. Miss S. Patterson's face flushed. "I'll reflect on what you've said," she managed, though it was clear this wasn't a conversation she expected or wanted to have. Principal Carter stood. "I hope you do," he said, "because as both the principal of this school and the father of a student in your class, I'll be paying close attention." As he opened the door, Imani stood outside, having heard enough to understand what had just happened. Her father gave her a reassuring nod, not just as her parent, but as her ally. For the first time since arriving at Ridgewood, Imani felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. In that small conference room, the silence that had followed her through the halls and into the classroom had finally been broken. And no matter what happened next, she knew her voice and her presence could no longer be ignored. The next morning, Imani Williams walked into Miss S. Patterson's classroom with her head held high, but there was a different energy in the air. Word had already started to spread about the tense meeting between Principal Carter and Miss S. Patterson. And though students weren't sure of all the details, they knew something significant had shifted. The silence that had surrounded Imani for weeks had begun to crack. As the class settled into their seats, Principal Carter himself walked into the room. The hum of low conversation evaporated into silence as every student turned to face the front of the classroom. Even Miss S. Patterson, usually so composed and in control, looked visibly unsettled. Principal Carter stood beside the teacher's desk, his presence calm yet commanding. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "Before we begin today's lesson, I wanted to take a moment to talk about something important, something that affects each and every one of you, whether you realize it or not." Imani sat near the middle of the room, her hands folded neatly on her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what her father was going to say, but she trusted him, not just as her father, but as a man who believed that truth always mattered, even when it was uncomfortable. There's been a lot of discussion recently about how we engage with literature in this class, whose voices are heard, whose perspectives are welcomed, and whose are dismissed, Principal Carter began. Literature, at its core, is about exploring the human experience, all human experiences. And it's our job as a school to ensure that every student, no matter who they are, feels seen, heard, and valued in that process. Miss S. Patterson's shoulders stiffened. She knew where this was going. Principal Carter's voice remained even, but there was a quiet authority behind his words. "It has come to my attention that one of our students has been repeatedly silenced, dismissed, and made to feel that her perspective, shaped by her lived experience, is somehow less valid than others. That is not what education is meant to be." Imani could feel every eye in the room flicker toward her, some with curiosity, others with guilt. For weeks, they had watched Miss S. Patterson's treatment of Imani without a word. Now, those moments were being exposed to the light. Without naming names, Principal Carter detailed the patterns of behavior, the selective dismissals, the uneven praise, the subtle but unmistakable ways bias had shaped the classroom dynamic. Every example painted a clear picture. The teacher, who should have been nurturing critical thinking, had instead been policing whose voices were allowed to contribute. "I want to be clear," Principal Carter said. "This isn't just about one student. This is about all of you. Because when you sit in silence while someone else is being silenced, you become part of the problem. When you watch bias happen and say nothing, you give it permission to continue." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew he was right. They had seen it, felt it, but they hadn't spoken up. Then, turning to Miss S. Patterson, Principal Carter added, As educators, we hold the power to shape how students see themselves, to either validate their experiences or erase them. And here at Ridgewood High School, we do not erase anyone. Miss S. Patterson opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no defense she could offer that would erase what had already been made clear. For the first time, the power dynamic in the classroom had shifted, and not in her favor. As Principal Carter concluded, his final words hung heavy in the air. Every student in this room deserves to belong here, not just to sit quietly, but to speak, to contribute, and to know that their voice matters. And it's our responsibility, every one of us, to make sure that happens. With that, he stepped back and gestured toward Imani. Imani, you've shown bravery in using your voice, even when it was easier to stay silent. Thank you for reminding all of us why that matters. Imani's face flushed, but she sat a little straighter. For the first time, the silence that had surrounded her wasn't exclusion, it was respect. When Principal Carter left the room, Miss S. Patterson's usual sharpness was gone. Her authority, once unquestioned, now felt fragile, exposed for its flaws. She stood at the front of the room, hands folded, eyes scanning the students who, for the first time, were really seeing her. "Let's begin," Miss S. Patterson said quietly. And for the first time, Imani knew that her voice had forced open a door that had been shut for far too long, not just for herself, but for every student who would walk into that classroom after her. In the days following the powerful confrontation between Principal Carter and Miss S. Patterson, the weight of silence that had hovered over Ridgewood High School began to lift. For weeks, Imani Williams had endured the subtle exclusion, the dismissive glances, and the cold indifference of her teacher, but now the truth was out. And truth has a way of changing things, whether people are ready for it or not. Miss S. Patterson still stood at the front of the classroom, but her presence no longer carried the same unchallenged authority. The students, those who had once followed her silent cues, those who had avoided pairing with Imani, and those who had felt too unsure or too afraid to speak, now saw her differently. The woman who once controlled every conversation now stood exposed, not as a monster, but as someone whose biases had shaped the space they all shared. And once seen, such truths are difficult to unsee. For Imani, walking into class no longer felt like stepping into hostile territory. Her classmates were no longer looking through her, they were seeing her. It wasn't all warmth and acceptance. Some students still avoided her out of discomfort, unsure how to engage with someone who had forced them to confront their own silence. But others, some who had said nothing before, began to approach her in quiet moments, offering small words of support. "I should have said something," one student confessed, nervously tugging at her sleeve. "I saw how she treated you. I just didn't want to get in trouble. I'm sorry." Imani didn't need apologies, but she appreciated the honesty. She knew firsthand how easy it was to stay quiet, to hope someone else would speak up. But she also knew that silence, when left unchecked, only feeds injustice. With Principal Carter's encouragement, Imani helped start a student advisory group, a space where students could openly discuss their experiences, from microaggressions in class to larger concerns about representation and equity in the curriculum. It wasn't always comfortable, but the conversations were real, and that mattered. Teachers across Ridgewood High began to take a harder look at their own biases. Some invited Imani to speak with their classes, sharing her experience and encouraging students to think critically about whose voices were centered in their lessons and whose were left out. Imani's bravery had done more than expose Miss S. Patterson's bias. It had given her classmates permission to question, to challenge, and to demand better. She hadn't just stood up for herself, she had shown everyone watching that one voice, even when trembling, can break through the heaviest silence. And while Miss S. Patterson continued to teach, she did so knowing that the students in her classroom were no longer passive observers. They had seen what bias looks like when no one speaks, and they had seen what courage looks like when someone does. Imani never set out to become a symbol, but in refusing to shrink, she became one anyway. And at Ridgewood High School, the lesson she left behind was one no one would forget. Silence may protect comfort, but truth, spoken aloud, has the power to transform. The story of Imani Williams didn't end the day Miss S. Patterson's bias was exposed, or when Principal Carter stood in front of the class and declared that every student's voice mattered. What followed was something deeper, a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of one English classroom at Ridgewood High School. Imani's courage to speak up, challenge authority, and insist on her right to be heard was not just about her own experience. It shined a light on a quiet, often invisible pattern that had existed long before she ever set foot in the school. There had always been students, especially students of color, who knew what it felt like to be dismissed, ignored, or subtly discouraged from fully participating. They had learned to shrink themselves, to sit quietly even when they had something to say, because they believed that was the only way to survive. But Imani had refused to shrink. In the weeks after the classroom confrontation, her classmates, some emboldened by her example, others ashamed by their own silence, began to speak more openly about the things they had experienced. They didn't just talk about Miss S. Patterson. They talked about the subtle ways their history lessons skipped over contributions from communities of color, the casual jokes made in hallways, the way some teachers seemed to hold black and brown students to stricter standards than their white peers. Imani's story had become a catalyst for a broader conversation, one that was uncomfortable for some, but necessary for all. At the encouragement of Principal Carter, Imani joined a newly formed Student Equity Council, made up of students from different backgrounds, races, and academic levels. Their goal wasn't to assign blame, it was to listen, learn, and advocate for change. Imani's voice was at the heart of those discussions, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Her classmates, once hesitant to stand beside her, now looked to her for leadership. They had seen her strength, not just in the moments where she spoke boldly, but in the moments when she stood alone and refused to back down. That kind of courage had a way of inspiring others to find their own voices. Teachers, too, were paying attention. Some quietly re-evaluated their own teaching methods, noticing for the first time which students they called on most often, whose opinions they automatically validated, and whose contributions they overlooked. Miss S. Patterson herself became quieter in her criticisms, more aware that her classroom was no longer a space where bias could go unchecked. Imani's story didn't just change Ridgewood High, it gave students, teachers, and even parents permission to rethink the culture they had all been complicit in maintaining. It showed that speaking up isn't about creating conflict. It's about creating space for truth to be heard. But for Imani, the most profound change was personal. She had walked into Ridgewood High expecting to work hard, prove herself, and earn respect the way. Her parents had always taught her through excellence and quiet dignity. But she left knowing that sometimes excellence isn't enough. Sometimes dignity requires making noise. She had learned that her voice, even when it shook, even when no one wanted to hear it, was powerful. That her experiences were valid, even when others tried to minimize them. And that no student, no matter their race, background, or identity, should ever have to choose between being accepted and being authentic. Imani's courage wasn't just about one classroom, one teacher, or one school year. It became part of her legacy, a reminder to herself and to everyone around her that silence protects nothing but injustice. Long after she graduated, the students who came after her would hear her story. They would know that a girl named Imani Williams once sat in their seat, raised her hand, and refused to let her voice be erased. They would know that the right to be seen, heard, and respected wasn't something they had to earn, it was something they already deserved. And Imani herself carried that lesson forward, not just at Ridgewood High, but in every room she would ever enter. Her voice, her story, and her courage would echo long after she was gone, reminding everyone that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. As we move through life, we learn that silence can sometimes feel like the safer choice. Whether at home, at work, or in our communities, many of us were taught that keeping the peace, even at the cost of our own voice, was the best way to avoid conflict. But the story of Imani Williams, a courageous young student who refused to be silenced, reminds us that there are times when speaking up is not just necessary, it's the only path to real change. Imani's journey through Ridgewood High School was not defined by her grades or her talents, but by her quiet bravery in refusing to accept unfairness. She walked into a classroom where bias lived just below the surface, where her voice was consistently dismissed, and where her presence was treated as a disruption. Rather than shrinking into the background, she stood her ground, not because it was easy, but because she knew her truth mattered, even if no one else wanted to hear it. For those of us who have lived long enough to see history repeat itself, there's a deep truth in Imani's story. We have seen how prejudice, exclusion, and injustice have appeared in different forms over the years, sometimes loud and blatant, but often quiet and polite. We've witnessed moments when speaking out came at a cost, and we've known people who chose silence because it felt safer. But we also know that every bit of progress we've seen, from civil rights to gender equality, happened because someone, somewhere, refused to stay silent. Imani's story also teaches us that no voice is too small to make a difference. Even when she stood alone, her refusal to accept silence rippled outward, giving others the courage to look inward at their own biases, at their own silence, and at the way they had contributed to the culture around them. That's the power of one voice. As older adults, we hold a special kind of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from seeing not just individual moments, but the patterns that connect them across generations. We know how powerful it is to tell our stories, to pass down the lessons we've learned, and to encourage the next generation to use their own voices. So, today, let's remember, we are never too old to speak up, to challenge injustice, or to support those who are finding their own voices. Whether in our families, our communities, or even online, we can be examples of courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that truth matters no matter how old we are. If this message resonates with you, we invite you to be part of the conversation. Like this video if you believe in the power of using your voice. Share a comment below. Tell us about a time when you spoke up or when someone's courage inspired you. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories that remind us of the lessons life teaches at every age. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that no matter how small a voice may feel, it can echo for generations. Because it's never too late to make your voice heard, and it's never too late to make a difference.